Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gelobet sei der Herr, mein Gott, which translates to Praised be the Lord. This is a chorale that actually holds some similarities to the chorale we looked at yesterday, so go ahead and check out yesterday's episode, especially if you want to compare the second system of this chorale to the modulatory scheme of yesterday's chorale, because there are definitely some comparisons to be made there that I'll talk about when we get there. This is another one of those chorales that has instrumental interludes, so those are removed and we're looking strictly at the vocal writing. Thankfully, the chorale holds up and there isn't too many funny businesses in between the vocal phrases, but still something to bear in mind. There are some things that could be happening in the instrumental development that would lead to a modulation, or why a particular key is being chosen at a certain point. But I think for all intents and purposes it's pretty straightforward, unlike some of the other chorales that we've looked at that have had instrumental interludes that have had an impact, or at least more of an impact, on the vocal tonality. But starting things off, we have two sharps in the key signature. We start on A major, we end on D major. I reckon we're in the key of D major, A major being our dominant. Our first cadence is what I'm calling an imperfect authentic cadence with a question mark in the key of G major. And yesterday I brought back the term subdominant cadence because this is pretty much exactly what the cadence at the beginning of yesterday's chorale felt like. It felt like we hadn't necessarily modulated, we were just tonicizing the subdominant, and what that ultimately alludes to is this idea that we're cadencing on 4 rather than 1. But because I don't know if that vocabulary is very conventional, I analyze it as an imperfect authentic cadence, which I think does just as much justice. Regardless, we have A major as our first chord. That is our 5 chord. That immediately proceeds to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic, neighboring 7th in the bass. Another D major chord here, D, F sharp, A, and E. This E being an accented non-chord tone. And then when the D resolves, we actually have movement here. In the other voices, we have E and we have G, which muddies the analysis a bit, but throughout the counterpoint, D I think is the implied chord. We then have F sharp, A, D, and A, which is D major in first inversion. And we can say that we've modulated to the key of G major at any point. To me, it feels like it happens right up against the cadence, so I'm going to say that it modulates on beat 4 after this, or these two neighbor tones in the lower voices. We have F sharp, A, D, and A, which is just another D major triad in first inversion. I'm going to call that our 5-6 chord in the key of G. That turns into not necessarily root position afterwards, because if we take away the F sharp, we're left with an open 5th, so the figured bass would change, but I don't really think this instance of a bass creating a change of inversion really contributes too much to the chord progression. It's just an interesting speaking point. But 5 does resolve to 1, G major, G, G, D, and B. And whether you look at this as cadencing 1 going to 4, or whether you look at this as cadencing from 5 to 1, I think they're both accurate analyses. Okay, moving ahead, we move back to the key of D major, which this phrase concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. So this G major chord is both 1 in the key of G and 4 in the key of D. That takes us to A major, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. As we started the chorale with, we get another A major chord, A, C sharp, and E. Passing tones in the inner voices before we get, yet again, A, C sharp, E, and A, another A major triad with a passing 7th in the bass. Then we get F sharp, C sharp, E, and A. I think we could call this a 3 chord that's happening here, or more specifically a 3-7 chord, but I think this F sharp, all 3 of these voices are basically just being suspended, and I really think that the harmonic rhythm gets displaced a bit here. As opposed to 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have 1, 2, 3, and 3, and 4, and. So I really do think that this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone. I guess that would make all of these accented non-chord tones, because we're looking at the chord on 4 and, which is C sharp, diminished over E, which is 7, 6. 3 can go to 7. It's a transitive progression, or at least that's what I've dubbed them, where the chord goes against the grain of the cycle of falling fifths. But yeah, I mean, if the chord can go in one direction, why can't it go in the other direction? And Bach has proven that time and time again. But you could say that there's a 3-7 chord happening here. I think it happens relatively briefly after being dominated, no pun intended, by the dominant chord. And then the fact that we get 5-7 afterwards, or sorry, 7-6 afterwards, is really just an extension of this entire measure spent being the dominant. Kind of like how the first complete measure that is, spends the entire time being one chord as well, just its function changes as it gets closer to the cadence. Or at least that's how I'm choosing to analyze it, even though it might not sound that way. But 7 goes where we would expect. It goes to our tonic, D, A, D, and F sharp. This B and this B right here kind of turns it into a passing 6 chord. We don't really need to talk about it. I mean, we could talk about it. We don't need to mark it down on the page. We want to talk about it. Then we have G, A, C sharp, and E. And we could call that a 4-2 chord, but it's interesting that the G here, if it were functioning like a 7th, or if this were a 4-2 chord, I would expect this to go down to F sharp, but here it reverses course and goes up to A, which makes me feel like this is actually more of a 5 chord, and this G is actually an accented non-chord tone, where we have A, C sharp, and E, before we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. And like I said, with these contrapuntal analyses, especially during the cadences, I don't really think there's a right or a wrong answer. I think it's very fascinating here that we have a chordal 7th that doesn't resolve down by step. If you do hear this like a 5-7 chord, I don't hear this like a 5-7 chord. I hear this bass as like 1-6-4-5-1, rather than this being a chord tone. I really just hear 4-5-1 happening very quickly before a resolution to the tonic, so I don't really hear this as a chordal 7th like other 5-7 chords operate, which makes me feel like this G is more of an embellishing tone than a chord tone. But literally, if you look on the downbeat, it is a 5-4-2 chord. That's why I offer the analysis. Same reason why I think this 3-7 chord is possibly analyzable there. But as we move ahead, we have another authentic cadence. This time it's an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D, so no modulation. We have another D major chord here, just some vocal rotation, D, D, F sharp, and A, just the voices moving around. Then we get G major, G, D, G, and B. That's our 4 chord, passing 7th in the bass. And then we get E, E, G, and B. That's E minor in root position. That's a 2 chord, 4 going to 2. Not the most normal progression, but we do see it sometimes, especially when we're closing in on a cadence, which we are. And I guess this too is functioning kind of like a cadential chord. Passing 7th again on the bass, passing tone in the alto before we get E, A, E, or sorry, C sharp, A, E, and A. That is A major in first inversion. That would be 5-6. Neighbor tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto. Then we get A, E, or sorry, I keep calling this A because we're coming from treble clef. C sharp, A, E, and G. That would be taking the chord and turning it into a 6-5, or a first inversion 7th chord because the 7th is there. And kind of just like the first phrase here, we could say that it turns into root position here, but we're taking away the third of the chord. It doesn't really feel like it's contributing to the chord progression too much, like the bass moving and still having the chord be a complete triad. It has a different sound. So when one of the tones is getting swapped out and leaving an incomplete chord, especially when it's a contextual tone like the third of a chord that is formed based on its triad, I don't think it really contributes too much, but we can talk about it. And then we have D major in root position, D, A, D, and F sharp. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of the dominant, A major. So I think this A major here, if we haven't already directly modulated to the key of A major in the context of the chorale, this is definitely a common chord. We have 5, which is A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, and in the key of A major, that is our tonic triad. We have A major again, A, C sharp, E, and F sharp. We could actually, apologies, that is definitely not a tonic triad. It's like We have the foundation of the tonic triad in the lower voices, but the melody changes that. We could call that F sharp minor, which, yeah, you know what, let's call it F sharp minor in first inversion, or F sharp minor 7 in first inversion, just like how we saw here, but this case it's in first inversion, and this time it is a 6-6-5 chord. I guess technically speaking, you could also call this, depending on how you hear this D and this C sharp here, you could call this 4-4-3. You can call this a D major 7 over A. They're more or less the exact same chord, just one has a D and one has an E. So depending on how you hear this chord, that's entirely up to you. Both of them are functioning as predominant chords. I think it's more along the lines of 6-5 because we're getting at least what I hear is a bout of adjacent harmony. We have parallel motion in the outer voices. It makes me feel like the chords are adjacent to one another. And this chord is, there's not room for debate on this chord. This is a G sharp diminished chord over B, which is 7-6. So 4 can go to 7, that's true, but I feel like the just the parallelism between the voices, the fact that everything is moving with similar motion. All the voices are moving in the same direction, kind of makes me feel like the chords are moving in that direction as well, especially when the outer voices, which are the ones that typically drive the tonality of the chorale from a listening standpoint, at least what I'm listening for direction. That's just what my intuition is, but ultimately it's up to you. 4 wants to go to 7, 6 can go to 7. It sounds like adjacent harmony to me. That's how I'm going to analyze it. And of course 7 goes to our tonic triad, A major over A, just root position C. Okay, I need to slow down for a second. This is A major, not in root position, but in first inversion. C sharp, E, A, and A. 1-6. This 6-6-5 chord here, this 4-4-3 chord, however you look at it, this is just a substitution for our tonic. We have an A major triad in the bass, just the melody is different, so E versus F sharp is really the difference here. If this were an E, it would be like 1-7-6-1-6, and if you've watched my videos in the past, you would know that that is one of the most common progressions we see in the chorales, and it is this is just it taking another form here, just the counterpoint, creating variety. But as you can see, the voices in this configuration pretty much outline that sound of tonic, leading tone, tonic in first inversion. Sometimes it happens in the other direction too. We then get B minor 7 over D, D, F sharp, A, and B. That's 2-6-5. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, and we would expect them in a cadential context, which we are nearing closely. The C sharp is an accent, or it's not an accent, a non-chord tone, it's just a non-chord tone. We then have E, E, A, and C sharp. That's A major over E. Second inversion tonic triad. We know that's functioning like a cadential 6-4. We often see 1-6-4 chords in cadential situations paired with 5 chords. Sometimes we see a chord in between 1-6-4 and 5, but most of the time they're paired together. And we get that here. We have E, D, G sharp, and B, which is E7 in root position. That is a 5-7 chord. Sometimes we use this bracket to show how they are paired together in a cadential context. This C sharp's in anticipation, this A natural's in anticipation, and then we have A major in root position, A, C sharp, E, and A. Perfect authentic cadence. Okay, looking ahead, we have another one of these subdominant cadences that I'm going to call an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. We start off with an A major triad, and we're actually going to go to G major via D major, which is why this feels like a subdominant cadence, but much more similarly to yesterday's subdominant cadences, this one feels a lot more G major-like rather than D major-like because of the use of the chordal 7th turning it into like a secondary dominant. If you compare that to the first cadence we don't have that C sharp versus C natural to dispel whether or not it's functioning like a secondary dominant, but the fact that we're seeing the same style of cadence twice makes me feel like this is just a variation on the previous iteration of it. So this A major triad here, A, C sharp, E, and A, This is our 5 chord in the key of D as well, and that goes where we'd expect, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is 5. And notice how we also get G natural here rather than G oh no, that's because we had G sharps here because we were in the key of A major for a little while. Pay no mind to that, that's just reversing the G sharps that we saw before. Neighboring this is not a 5 chord, this is a tonic triad. Sorry, I was just talking about the 5 chord. Neighboring 7th in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto. We get another D major triad here, D, D, F sharp, and A. Passing tones in the alto in the bass before we get F sharp, A, and D, which is a D major triad in first inversion. We just need the figure bass to change. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. I'm going to say we modulate here. This is how it sounds like it's modulating to me. The C natural after it is, that's just how it sounds to me. I guess we could say the analysis for G major happens as early as the first beat of this measure, but that it doesn't. That would be just basing it off of what it sounds, what it looks like on the page, as opposed to what it sounds like. If your audiation skills are really good, maybe it would still point you in the direction towards the end of the first measure. But yeah, it sounds like it's happening before the C major to me. This sounds like 5-4-3 in the key of G major. But yeah, this is still a 5-6 chord. Neighbor tone in the bass before we get F sharp, D, A, and C, which is taking the chord and turning it into a 7 chord, more specifically a 7 chord in first inversion. So we'll just change the figured bass to reflect that, which is 6-5. And then we have D, D, A, and C. Again, same thing here. We don't need to say that it's in root position now because we're losing the third, which is probably the most important contextual tone in like a major or minor triad, right? Because otherwise it's androgynous. We don't know what the quality of the chord is. And of course we cadence on G major, G, D, G, and B. And this is where we start to hear our modulatory scheme that we had yesterday, where we get movement of keys that suggests the tones of the G major scale. So this is the 4 of the scale. Then we get movement to the key of A major, and this is similar to the actual the literal keys that we saw yesterday. We see G, and then we're going to A. So we have another G major triad here, G, D, G, and B, but immediately we get G sharp in the next measure in the alto, which is interesting. So I don't think we've modulated yet. We have a passing 7th in the bass here, and then we get E major, E, E, G sharp, and B. And I think that again, just like yesterday, we are modulating over a secondary dominant. Now, if I redacted the rest of the chorale, like I just pretended that the rest of it didn't exist, if I heard an E major in the context of G major, I would expect a 2 chord afterwards, just like how I would have expected a 2 chord yesterday. Now here, I'm doing the exact same thing. I have 5 of 2 because E is the dominant of A. However, because we're moving to the key of A major, we know this information because we can see it and we've listened to the chorale, or hopefully we've listened to the chorale. This is now just a 5 chord in the key of A. We get D sharp immediately afterwards, bringing attention to this E, which is interesting. It's almost as if we're going to the key of E major rather than we're going to the key of A major, but I think this is just an expressive tone, some expressive chromaticism that's really bringing attention to E. We haven't quite revealed yet that we're in the key of A until we get nearer to the cadence, but we pretty much get 5 for the entirety of the measure, and we follow the same pattern. This is really just like a chromatic sequence. We're going from G to A, both major keys, or I guess D to A, depending on how you look at it. But this D sharp is a chromatic neighbor tone, this F sharp is a neighbor tone, we get another E major chord here, passing tones in the alto and the bass, then we have G sharp, B, B, and E that's taking the chord and putting it in first inversion, neighbor tones in the alto and the bass again before we get G sharp, E, B, and D. Again, that's just taking the first inversion triad and turning it into 6-5. This E kind of turns it into root position, but we get rid of the third to do that, so I feel like it's not as important to mark. That hasn't changed, and our imperfect authentic cadence ends on A major, A, E, A, and C sharp. Now, very similar to yesterday's, this A major chord is functioning like our tonic in the key, or sorry, our dominant in the key of D major. but our cadence at the end of the next phrase, even though it's short, is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor. This sounds very much like B minor, not like a deceptive cadence. We're not going from A major to B minor. It really feels like we're cadencing in B minor with the A sharps. So we're just doing so through D, and then we get a pivot to the relative minor, which is B minor. So 5 goes to 1, D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, our tonic triad. We then go to G major, G, D, G, and B, that's our 4 chord, neighbor tone in the bass, G, D, A, and C sharp. I think this G is an accented non-chord tone, and really what we're looking for is this F sharp, D, A, and A, which is our tonic triad and first inversion D major. And then we move to E minor, E, G, G, and B, which is our 2 chord, and just like yesterday's chorale, our 2 chord is now functioning like our 4 chord in the key of B minor, our relative minor. Passing tone in the bass, this B is a chord tone, this F sharp is a passing tone in the alto as well. Lots of passing tone and bass doubling here where they're doing the same gesture at the same time in their respective registers. That's interesting. And here we have a very interesting chord as well. The chord on the and a 4 isn't as interesting. That's our 5 chord that would lead to our 1, making our authentic cadence. But before that we have C sharp, B, E, and C sharp. So this is implying a 2-7 chord. This could be, we don't know if this is 2-7, we don't know if it's 2 fully diminished 7. I'm assuming that it's a half diminished chord. Let me go ahead and rewrite that as well. I'm assuming that it's a half diminished chord, but we don't know if it's just a regular 2-7 chord because this is a triad that's missing its 5th. We know that the chord is being implied because 75% of the chord is there, but the 3rd of the chord in terms of a diminished triad is not very important. It's the 5th of the chord that the triad gets its name from. So when the chord is missing the 5th, in this case we don't have a G going on. We don't even have a G on the and of the beat either to justify that that's what's happening. We don't know if this is a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, which would yield a minor 7th chord, or if it's a harmonization of harmonic minor or even natural minor, where we have a half diminished 7th chord. Regardless, I'm going to make an educated guess and say that this is a 2 half diminished 7th chord, just incomplete, but we don't know. Because the 5th of the chord is missing, and that makes the quality of the chord androgynous. Regardless, we have F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C happening here, and that is a offbeat. That's an offbeat 5 chord, F sharp major, which is our dominant in the key of B minor, and 2-5-1 is a pretty typical cadential formula in the key, or just in general. Minor or major. Bach did not discriminate, and he just treated both keys fairly equally in terms of the chords that see usage in cadential situations, but we cadence on B minor, B, F sharp, and D, our tonic triad. And for our last cadence, which is a perfect authentic cadence for our last cadence, perfect authentic cadence in the key of D, our last phrase I think modulates straight off to D major. We have this a little bit of false relations here, or cross relations. Am I forgetting the term? I know false relations is one way to refer to it. I use the term all the time. It'll come back to me. A sharp and A natural happening in close proximity to one another from one phrase to the next. This B minor chord could be looked at as our submedium. We then go to D major over F sharp, A, D, and A. That's our tonic triad and first inversion. We then have G, G, D, and B. Lots of 1 going to 4 in this chorale. G majors are 4. We have some passing tones in the lower voices before we get B, E, D, and G. Now, depending on how you look at this chord, you could look at it as G, D, D, and F sharp. I think that's less likely. In fact, I'm not even going to bother writing that. That would be an incomplete G major 7 chord without the 3rd. I don't think it's super likely using Bach's vocabulary. It would be relatively unlikely. This A is also a passing tone as well. But here I think this is a 2-4-3 chord, which is very interesting. E minor 7 over B. That gets kind of turned into a 6-5 chord here in the bass, but that gets interrupted by this F sharp here. It definitely would be more likely for us to see a 2-6-5 chord in this context, but with the F sharp, in cadential situations, Bach gets contrapuntal, and it becomes far more about the line rather than the chords. The bass and the supporting voices create a semblance of the harmony that's being implied, but with all the voices rushing around and going in their different directions, it's less about the chords occurring exactly on the same vertical moment on the timeline, and more so about them occurring in proximity to one another. The treatment of dissonance and the flowiness of the chorale is a hallmark of counterpoint in the music that preceded Bach and influenced him. So yeah, I'm going to say 2-4-3 here, but there's also hints of 2-6-5. That F sharp doesn't invalidate, but muddies the analysis, makes it a little less valid. And then we get A, D, and E. I think this D is like a 4-3 suspension over the bass that gets enclosed by this B here. So I think 5 is being implied. We have a neighboring 7th here in the bass. This D is a non-chord tone. This B is a non-chord tone. This F sharp is a non-chord tone. This G is a non-chord tone. Lots of context, ornamental notes being used here. Before we get A major with our resolution on the beat, on the numerical beat that we would traditionally count on the harmonic rhythm, A, C sharp, and E, with the passing 7th of the bass before we get D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, and a perfect authentic cadence, root position triad. And that is today's analysis. So it's interesting to see a completely different melody from yesterday. At least I think it's a different melody. I'd have to compare it to yesterday's notes, but the fact that we're seeing a similar section at the end as far as how the cadences are being treated, Bach must have been really jibing with this particular scheme, because we're seeing the exact same modulation idea happening here. It was in terms of like G major yesterday, so instead of D major, he's moving around the circle of fifths, right? He had C, and then he had D, and then he had E minor, as opposed to G, A, and B minor, which is the 4, 5, and 6 of both scales respectively, which is a really interesting thing to see across two different scales and two different melodies. I think this partially has to do with the fact that melodies often use many of the same patterns. There are only so many permutations that a melody could have for it to sound good and be singable. Only certain intervals are being used in the melody. They're very singable and serviceable as melodies that could be sung and memorized by a congregation, right? Because most of these cantatas served all of them served a religious function. And I would imagine that the congregation would be singing the melody with the supporting voices and the instruments. Maybe not, I'm not up to date really on the history, even though it's been around for a very long time. But regardless, the melodies are very simple, and as a result of that, we see that a lot of the same patterns emerge. And Bach, being an absolute master and having had encyclopedic knowledge of the tunes that were used in the church, which was the cornerstone of his society, the fact that he could attribute certain chord progressions to particular melodic patterns is common sense, right? It makes sense that he would be repurposing certain things in certain contexts. Bach was much more an artisan than he was an artist, if that makes sense. At least that's the way that I look at it. Not to downplay the artistry that's in his music, of course. I just feel like, especially in his cantatas, they were much more about function, if that makes sense. And that's coming more and more to light as we're seeing the patterns that emerge in the harmonic analysis. But I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you'd like a daily dose of analysis or a daily dose of Bach, at least that's the music that I'm analyzing presently, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon. I upload daily, like I just said, and you'll be notified of when I upload. But on that note, again, thank you so much for watching the video. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.